That's better. Hello, everyone. Right, so welcome to the gallery, welcome to this lovely event, and I want to welcome Griselda Pollock. So I'm delighted to welcome Professor Griselda Pollock, who's Director of, for those of you who don't know, Centre for Cultural Analysis, Theory and History, which is otherwise known as Centre CAP at the University of Leeds, where she's also Professor of Social and Critical Histories of Art at the School of Fine Art and History, Art and Cultural Studies.
Yeah, we specialise in as many words in any title as you can.
So Griselda, I believe, is the author of over 25 books. Yes. Her work as a writer and a thinker and a teacher has been profound in its feminist interventions and influence. She is, and has continued to be, an inspiration, not only for those of us who've been fortunate enough to have had her as a teacher, but also to those who desire to find a voice for, of, and as women within cultures that otherwise limit that desire and ambition. Tonight, Griselda Pollock's here to talk about the work of Christine Taylor Patton and the question of drawing time. The time of drawing that is implicit to Patton's practice and has been for several decades. Christine Taylor Patton is an artist whose work I first came across under the radar of, and by way of Griselda's book, Encounters in the Virtual Museum, Time, Space and the Archive, which I think we have 2 copies upstairs if anyone's interested. This was a book that was being conceived and written during the years I was fortunate enough to be part of this larger feminist project that was happening at the University of Leeds. Of course, little did I know then what would be happening now, that I'd have a gallery and that this would be occurring and we'd be co-curating this show together. Afterlives, indeed. Yes. So as I look around and as all of you have now encountered these 251 micros and the macro, I'm prompted to reflect upon not only the presence of time, but through their linear construction, but also this iteration from one to the next, but also to the sheer effort and the sheer commitment to something that's required to enable instance of understanding. So when Adrian Rifkin, I was looking at the back of the book, when Adrian Rifkin described Griselda Pollock's book Encounters in the Feminist Museum as complex, excessive and defiant in its creation of rooms, of imaginary exhibitions, he claims she has invented a new feminist history for the future. So tonight, this is an effort to continue that future work of feminism in some way. I hope we have created such a room in which you are all welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always a remarkable pleasure to actually give a talk about artists when everybody's got the actual artwork. So that's partly why we decided to do it here, not to sort of find a room and get hundreds of people and make it in a lecture, because whenever you get bored with what I'm saying, your eyes can just drift along this work. So I'm going to talk about a number of things tonight. One is obviously about what you're actually looking at. The first thing is, what are you looking at, and how do we begin that process of making sense of something that's presented to you in an exhibition, because it's not in the studio, you haven't got the artist talking, you've got me instead, unfortunately, but also because I want to talk about the context in which this work is in London as part of a project which is going to find, hopefully, not this actual work, but this project at the Istanbul Biennale in 2015, which is going to be in September, and I want to link it up with that particular project. I also want to, in some ways, make it possible for Christine to be present, so I'm going to use her words to a certain amount, not because I want to, I think the art doesn't stand alone, but of course I think the art is an indication of a certain kind of mind, a certain kind of ethos, a certain kind of position in the world that I would also want to elaborate. So let me just start with talking a little bit about what you're actually looking at. So Christine Taylor Patton began a project to undertake to draw 2,000 drawings, one for each year of the Christian millennium. So she planned to do this starting around 1997, and she thought she'd get them done by the year 2000, which of course didn't happen because it's a much more complex project. But each of the drawings is numbered, you know, AD 1, AD 2, AD 3, right the way through. And so we have something in the first millennium, as Adriana said, we're in the Dark Ages, we're around about when the Anglo-Saxons were around. But what will be shown in Istanbul is from the year 1000 to 2000, so the more recent millennium. And the idea was that this device of setting a protocol of drawing a 1 inch by 1 inch square using a crow quill pen, that's to say a pen made from a crow's quill, so an organic pen, not a steel nib, nothing's going to harsh. There's very much an organic relationship with a certain kind of paper that itself has its own sort of levels of resistance to any mark that's made on it. So it's not a smooth surface, it's going to catch, it's going to produce a certain amount of resistance. And ink. So this has a certain kind of minimalist element. You know, a square, you know, a piece, an organic quill, the ink, and then off you go. And the idea is that each drawing creates a little event, and then out of those events all sorts of things could happen, but she's going to follow one, and then it will prompt the next one and prompt the next one. So when you look around, you are looking at a sequence in which there is no predestiny. There is no sense as to where, once you put a dot and you split it, that you can see where the drawings will go to. So you're in a process as you move along the line of going alongside her own discovery. But of course these discoveries are themselves not instant, because each drawing may take about a week, because there is a very profound sense of exploration, even on this micro scale, of what could happen in relation to this fundamental tension between dark and light. Okay, because in a sense you have a blank piece of white paper. Once you start blotting out its whiteness, you begin to start producing light. And there's a difference between the whiteness of the page and the light that is the effect that's produced by the stylectic between what you expose and what you don't expose. So it seems to me that one has here, it's very difficult because you come and you walk along, etc., but you know, it's almost in a sense you need a perpetual movement, and we were just doing this as we were talking, but then the game becomes to generate the kinds of things that pop into your head as you do that movement, which are permitted because you move from things that are kind of constructivist and abstract and flat to things which look like comets. It looks like, you know, we were talking about the ones around there where it's almost like a black hole is forming as things are being compressed and drawn in. And those sort of associations are entirely suitable because this absolutely systematic, abstract practice of drawing that can, you know, operates within some relation to what we could think of as both as minimalism, this idea of an art that sets itself its own protocol and then just follows it with logic, is in a sense a revelation of something which we could go to at the level of contemporary physics and contemporary thinkings about how actually matter and process in the physical world generates itself. There is not sort of suddenly this is physics on the wall, but I was having a conversation with somebody today who was an editor in mathematics, and we had this conversation. He was saying, well, you know, mathematics would exist even if we didn't know it. So I had to kind of double take. So this is a really interesting thing. So I'm thinking, you know, yes, of course, the kind of mathematical nature of the physical universe certainly is, but mathematics obviously is that moment where some kind of conceptual grasp of this process becomes a logic which then can be formed by certain kinds of, you know, writing equations or even thinking through. So when these great people do all these great sort of, you know,
equations on the board, and goes on for board after board after board, and they say, "Oh right, you proved somebody's theorem." I look in absolute perplexity. I have no idea, etc. But there is some kind of interesting correlation between the systematized form of a representation of something that does exist, but isn't, as it were, identical with the representation of it. But there is this gap, and that, in a sense, might be what we would call the poetic gap. So, the mathematicians and the physicists themselves operate in a universe between a sense of processes and the means that we have for finding some kind of way of grasping them, representing them, without simply abstracting from them. So there's a difference between abstraction, where you withdraw from the real of the world, and a certain kind of way in which we have to produce something that is an abstracted form of the world, but it is in this conversation with the world. So I wanted to set that up because the context for this, as I say, is these, ultimately in this whole work is 2,000 drawings, which are then going to be complemented by one 24-foot by 7-foot drawing, so more or less the length of that wall, for which the drawing upstairs is called Imagine, is a sketch. So a certain process. Now that's an interesting idea. A sketch for an abstract work may perplex you, but there is that question of what happens in the grand scale is not this density of all sorts of possibilities of drawing, but actually a similar kind of question is, what is the process of change? So what you have, most of her drawings start with just a line across them, and then what the drawing happens around it is to begin to map out some kind of sense of how a plane turns over, or what's the hinge point where difference actually occurs. And if I say those things, I'm describing what happens in the drawing, but the language in which I'm talking of the drawing is not that the drawing is illustrating, it is exactly that, but I'm forced in the talking about it to begin to participate in the notion of change, of difference, and of transition. So if you think, though, this is what you've got actually here, I want to set this in the context of where this work is now going to go to. The director of the Istanbul Biennale is somebody called Karolin Christoph Bakagiev, who's one of a generation or a group of critical curators who disowns the idea that she's a curator. She's a thinker working in the world of putting exhibitions together. She's always very not interested in the kind of professionalization of the new curator as the sort of new author to frame exhibitions. So she calls herself an exhibition maker. And she's established a framework for the Biennale in Istanbul. And this is going to be held 3 years after she directed Documenta 13, which is seen to be one of the kind of remarkable exhibitions of the last decade. And she did the 13th Documenta, which, in fact, 2015 is going to be 60 years since Documenta was set up, and that will be important in a minute. This is also the year in which Okwe Nwezo, the Nigerian curator, who curated Documenta 11 in 2002 and made an absolutely sort of benchmark change in challenging the question of Eurocentrism and engaging with the question of post-colonial. But he is going to direct, he's directing now, any minute now it'll open the Venice Biennale 2015. So you have Venice and Istanbul on the eastern Mediterranean, one still sort of in the heart of Europe and Italy, and Istanbul in this extraordinary position of literally bridging the edge of the European continent and the beginning of the Asia Minor. And so Karolin, I'm going to get confused with two C's, Karolin Christoph Bakagiev has taken up the Bosphorus, has taken up this particular passage of water between these two elements as the sort of framework for the Biennale. So she's called it Salt Water, a theory of thought forms. And I hope you can begin to see that this is a kind of interesting set of these relationships between what words evoke in us and how they begin to tip us into metaphor, but also into sort of new kinds of ways of conceptualizing relationships between various things. So with that, Venice and Istanbul standing in this kind of freighted and symbolic relation to the geopolitics of the ancient Mediterranean world, the world in which, as it were, the year one starts, or the year naught of the year, Anno Domini starts, as it were, because of an event on the eastern Mediterranean in relation to Eastern, Greek culture as well as Middle Eastern culture and its longer histories, but also, of course, we're in the midst of the fact that everybody's eyes are focused on that part of the world. The three little girls went to Turkey to get to Syria. Turkey is absolutely on the borderlines itself, in a very fraught state in its own relationship. Is it part of the Islamic world? Is it part of still modernizing in the hopes of being part of the European world? And of course 2015 will mark the date of the Armenian genocide in 1915, which is not acknowledged within official Turkish history, but is something that became nameable because of the Holocaust and the invention of a concept of the name of a crime, genocide, in the aftermath of that, which of course is playing itself out in other parts of the Middle East in terms of Israel-Palestine and its relations. So there's a very complex set of things to be thought about to position an exhibition now, or even for an artist to participate in it. Now, when Arnold Bode founded the documentary, excuse me, I'm going to be a little art historical for a minute, but you'll see it does weave itself back together. In 1955, this artist called Arnold Bode created Documenta, which has now become this defining sort of kingpin, as it were, of all the biennales that give us this access to what's happening in contemporary art. Bode was trying to rejoin the broken threads of Germany to modernism, because when Hitler came to power, the first thing that Third Reich did was, in a sense, to not only designate the Jews not to exist, but modernism was identified as being Jewish and was exiled. All the curators were sacked who proposed anything to do with modernism. The pictures were taken down from the wall, they were deaccessioned. But there was this huge exhibition called Entartete Kunst, Degenerate Art, which was the first ever retrospective exhibition of European modernism on the European continent, but under the rubric of its degeneracy and to be ridiculed. So Bode's idea was somehow, fascism had sort of risen up like this terrible monster between the trajectory of modernism, and now the way to restore and to reunite the world was to reinsert into Germany, through Documenta, the belief in universalist modernism in the language of abstraction. And what is so interesting in relation to what I said about Ocwi and Wezor, and then in terms of Karolin Christoph Bakagiev, we inherit that sort of legacy, but after 50 now and almost 60 years, Documenta, that the idea of abstraction doesn't hold that. We do not believe that we could have some supranational, international abstract language of art which would save us from the dirt of politics. We're absolutely so besmirched by by this at this particular point, that we can't, sustain that particular idea. And so for a biennale deeply marked by ancient histories and intensely agitated by those which are unfolding as we speak, I have proposed to the Istanbul an artist whose practice can only be described as abstract, and whose fidelity to both a medium and a kind of protocol might immediately identify her with this now disowned sense that art can be some kind of language separated, some kind of modernist aesthetic. So how can this make sense? Why would I propose this kind of work for this kind of context? So, as I've mentioned, Karolin Christoph Bakagiev's concept is saltwater, a theory of thought forms. And I just want to read you into this, the press release that's in the public realm, and then perhaps you can begin to see how I could see, well, this is the perfect framework for the intelligibility of this work now, not as something that seems to be an old hanging on from this other ethos. She says the international exhibition will present new works by over 50 artists and other practitioners in a city-wide exhibition on the Bosphorus that considers different frequencies and patterns of waves, the currents and densities of water, both visible and invisible, that poetically shape and transform the world. With and through art, we commit ourselves to the possibility of joy and vitality, leaping from form to flourishing life. Saltwater, a theory of thought forms, the 14th Istanbul Biennale, looks for where to draw the line, to draw upon, and to draw out, through organic and non-linear forms that reconnect the research in art and its processes with other knowledges, including biosciences and oceanography, physics, mathematics, environmental studies, as well as storytelling, philosophy, and its counterpoint in the brain studies of today's neuroscience. It will do so offshore, on the flat surfaces with our fingertips, also in the depths underwater, before the enfolded encoding unfolds. So the very language of this seems to anticipate some kind of resonance between the ways in which waveforms, frequencies, evocations of great universes or deep depths or formings and unformings are actually played out for us even in this small section of this particular work. So I want to set those words in relation to three quotations from Christine Taylor Patton to bring her voice into play, but also to see how the ways in which she's writing of her work and of her practice as someone who draws. Now, I've written about this before. There is no word for an artist who draws. You can have a painter, you can have an etcher, you can have a designer, but a draftsman is a different thing. And you can't go around saying, well, she's a drawer. I mean, it doesn't even, I don't know, it has a dessinateur. I mean, in different languages it works very differently. I think it's very, very fascinating, this absolutely almost or foundational gesture that we know that art generates in the making of a mark of any sort that has no name. And then we have drawing, the gerund, this form that it is itself not a painter, but you make a drawing. It contains some very interesting ideas itself. But anyway, this is Christine accepting and enjoying the affinities between the research process of her drawing practice and the other worlds and knowledge systems around her. Like Eva Hess before her, Patton tracks down complexity through procedural simplicity and the unexpected events that occur across her interacting and co-generating series. And this is a quote from her. In the illusion of complexity, in the illusion of repetition, of little movements, the universe is what it is, changing forms, changing illusions, changing metaphors, changing change. And by using such a simple tool, a tiny pen tip, a tiny bit of ink at a time, a tiny space on any size paper, I get to see more than when I try to look at it all at the same time. Its contradictions and baffling processes lead me to discovering the kinds of things that physicists discover when they watch atoms with their quarks and electrons, and the kinds of things that surgeons discover when they open up human beings' bodies, and the kind of things astronomers see when they take pictures of places millions of miles away and moving out. Because when a human being moves a hand and leaves a trace of that movement, part of the universe is being exposed. The second generation movement, the ink on the paper, mimics all other movements in the universe, irregular, baffling, metaphysical, abstract as well as concrete movement. I feel like I get an inside view of it all, trapped there for a while on that paper, trapped in time in my brain, ready to lend perspective to the next movement, changing the context of the next movement, the next stroke, the next day of this life that is such a mystery. She then goes on to say, drawing isn't cool. I can't use it to show that I'm disattached from life, from others, from ideas, from mind or purpose. I am guilty of being utterly consumed by the process of observation in relation to all of the past and all of the future and all of now. My detachment is not disattachment. There are different parts of the act of living. I prefer to let attachment and detachment coexist in the process of my life and acknowledge that what I discover has been discovered before, but not by me. So I must do this so that I can see and take my next step in this larger context, and then the next step. Drawing is such a vital force, taking on new ideas and new ways of using it to discover what this grand experiment is all about. The fact that sometimes a drawing can be beautiful should not deter us from recognizing that its beauty is secondary to its process, not unrelated, but just another part of the gift that all forms of life are to us. In our own humility as human beings, we can acknowledge that there is no one way to do things, although there are many ways to do one thing, and that's what I'm curious about. And one final quote. For 50 years I have drawn because I am compelled to. Images come from deep within, from where my spirit begins and reaches out to the visible world, searching for resonance and meaning. As I draw, I examine qualities in human nature that are like the wind or waves of water, of the invisible power of time and repetition. I find all of life in a single stroke of a pen, in the accumulation of the tracks of my being, there on paper for all to see. Millions of strokes become a whole, exposing what was never seen before. My drawings are the byproducts of my examination of life, unlike a membrane which catches and makes visible the movement that passes through it. So, I find those so profoundly just simple, explicit, and absolutely direct about what it is to sort of dedicate your life to being an artist, to have that sense of a project, an enormous project, but I think this idea of it doesn't matter if you are, in some sense, belonging in a community of other artists. There are some connections, but it is a moment of revelation which is shared. And this is incredibly important for art historians whose curse is that they look for similarity, right? And I always say to my students, do not believe for one instance that somebody gets up in the morning and dedicates day after day to doing something just for somebody to come along and say, oh, it's just like, right? So there's a different way of understanding where does artwork fit in. And while I've been trying to identify the specificity of the practice, the process, what actually is happening in Christine Taylor Patton's studio to produce this, what in a sense is the ethos, the position in relation to life, the disposition of this artist by those quotations. It's also vital to understand that there is a context for this which we can recognize. But in some ways, so that's the first thing I want to say. So when I look at the work that I've been doing over the last few years in terms of being invited, very fortunately invited by different members of deceased artists' families or dealers who are trying to bring artists to view. Most of these are women. Most of them are belatedly being recognized. I can actually begin to rebuild something very interesting around the 50s, around the 60s and 70s, which is what happened between the high moment of abstraction, particularly in American art, which was played out through painting and sculpture, and then the taking that into a whole different series of materials and processes. Artists like Hannah Wilkie, who is an abstract artist fundamentally, who was exploring gestures and movements and folds and materials in this a new interplay between embodiment and a kind of ethico-political engagement and the use of form and process, not abstracted in the kind of grand moment that we have from the first 50 years of abstraction in the 20th century, but one that was embodied and engaged. And very recently, and Virginia will know this, we had this wonderful occasion that Linda Benglis's work has been brought to Britain for the very first time. Another artist in her 70s having a show here, obviously has had a more visible public career in New York and Europe. But what was very fascinating was I was offered the opportunity to speak with her, to interview her, which kind of terrified me down to the ends of my kind of my clinking jewellery, as it were. And I thought, well, what I will do is I'm going to disperse the anxiety. So the first thing I put up were photographs of her that I kept finding, because have to think, obviously, if you know who Linda Benglis is, you'll know that there's a very, very, very famous photograph from 1974 that I was not going to show. But all the photographs that are on there are of her holding her dog. So I said, okay, what's with the dog? Because I'm in a reading group with lots of people who are interested in Haraway and species stuff, and Carolyn Christopher-Cargill is passionate about her dog. So if you look at pictures, there's always the dog. So this whole movement being interested in the other species. So I thought, fine, we'll pick this one up. But she did this extraordinary thing, because I said, what's with the dog? And she just said, well, when you hold it, it kind of, breathes. And then she went on from this to talk about how something in what she was doing in her sculpture, and I just that gesture, and it just opened up an entirely different perspective from the kind of closed fixity of the art historical writing, which is that she was this, raunchy broad who came and posed nude, to try and get some sort of action from the art world, as opposed to another kind of take on this question of why is abstraction still such a vital and brilliant sort of language and unexhausted potential in 20th century, that actually when you look at it, women very powerfully took up. So the generation, because we're not told of Helen Frankenthaler and Louise Nevelson and Joan Mitchell and Lee Krasner, you think of abstraction in the masculine, the Jackson Pollocks, the Mark Rothkos, the things. But actually, they were the precedents who, when people like Linda Benglis or Hannah Wilkie or and Eva Hesse and indeed Christine Taylor Patton were coming of age as artists, they could take it in a certain kind of new direction, embody it, give it life, give it a different kind of essence. So it wasn't withdrawal, but it was actually impassioned engagement. So I would want to put Christine's work in relation to that conversation, relation particularly also a very extreme one, obviously, to people like Agnes Martin, who is also coming into view on one extreme end of sort of spiritualizing abstraction in a particular way, although it's grounded in landscape, deeply grounded in landscape, and the endless Canadian plains, whatever. So this question of can we find a place for this work in any kind of narratives of what happened in the 20s? Yes, only if we rewrite that history to include, not to separate, but to include the women who were made, who were enabled by certain legacy of the 1950s to take it in new various directions, particularly with new materials, obviously many of which, unfortunately, Hannah Wilkie and Eva Hesse were killed by the materials. Linda Benglis seems to have survived being exposed to latex and various kinds of horrible polystyrens and things like that, so she was much more careful with the chemical dangers of them, etc. But there is a place for this, and it is in a kind of conversation. And I'm just going to end with this little book, of which I only have a copy upstairs, but you can order it, which is one of the things that Christine Taylor Patton did to enable her to continue to work, was to be the night companion for Georgia O'Keeffe in the last 3 or 4 years of her life. If any of you have been to New Mexico, you have to understand the profundity of this landscape. And when I went to Abiquiu, which is one of the 2 houses that Georgia O'Keeffe lived in, Ghost Ranch is one, but Abiquiu is in this little village, and it's got the only view in New Mexico. It's to say, New Mexico is a landscape which is constantly difficult for you to do what you do if you're a landscape person. Is, how does that configure as a view? Because it has an endlessness, a constant shiftingness, and constantly attracting you with the different. Because it's not like we have. Okay, we're taught to see European. There's a view. It's got a foreground. It's got a mountain here. It's got a tree. But actually, the picture window in Abiquiu is the only view I've ever seen in the New Mexico. But that's beside the point. But anyway, the idea that I love this idea of these 2 extraordinary artists. One from the very profound moment of exploration of abstraction at the beginning of the century in the form of Georgia O'Keeffe, and then this young woman coming from California, trained in Los Angeles at the Otis so just at the point at which the feminist take and challenge to the art education was actually happening around her, sent these two people together in the stillness of a night. And these two ethos, I don't know what the plural of ethos, ethoi or something like this, these two sort of ethical, political, aesthetic dispositions, just having those conversations through the wall, or the delicacy of certain caring for an elderly person. I don't know if any of you have done any of this caring for an elderly body. I found this very profound in one sense. So, and this is the most beautiful book written by one artist in a meeting with another artist across that time, in which this way of appreciating the entirety of the aesthetic and ethics of one artist and how it was reflected in the entirety of another artist. But of course, now that I've said that, there's a terrible danger that you're going to fall into the trap, which is anybody who comes from New Mexico, there's Georgia O'Keeffe as the sort of the one. But what I'm trying to create is a much more complex thing, which goes back to what you, Adriana, so kindly said about the virtual feminist museum. The world does not give us the conversation between women and between themselves and their worlds and all the things they think about. They just select a few for us to know, and they exclude the others. So it's been my passion, once I'd encountered Christine Taylor Patton, as indeed I've worked with many other artists, that when I get there, or when I'm taking, you can't just write about everybody, you have to be able to work with passion with someone, that it is important that we get the whole picture. So this is part of my continuous work to bring things into visibility. And I hope I've given you some framework for why this show is in London now, what you're actually looking at and how you can go back and look at it, and how it intersects so extraordinarily, or resonates so extraordinarily, with what will be the ethos and concept of this remarkable Biennale, in terms of trying to think, where does art now intersect with forms of knowledge, forms of politics, forms of history, through its forms, through this is a sort of a theory of thought forms, that it isn't thought versus form, theory versus art, but these are forms of thinking, but they come to us through form. So I'm very happy to take any questions or anything that you would like to say or comment or talk to each other about the drawings.
Thank you.
There's Rebecca at the back.
I just wanted to ask about the actual curation of this work here.
Mm-hmm.
Because I can imagine now, but I don't know quite what form it's going to take. So I wondered how you selected the work for here, and also the way that it's been installed in this line. Is that how it will be installed in Istanbul, or was there something particular about putting it into this space?
Thank you for the question. The forms of installation are determined by Christine Taylor Patton. Okay, so this 250 drawings have been framed, which in this particular form, and she's identified the 60 inches from the ground and the units of that, so that it is the linearity is hers. We are experimenting with the space, because there's two things. One is the ideal form. I think for Christine, the ideal form for showing the second 1,000 would be a spiral, a double-sided spiral that you would literally, come in and go round, and then you sort of find yourself coming and going round the back, etc. So that we did the space. There isn't a space in Istanbul waiting for us, because it would, like, one work would take up the kind of room in the museum bit of it that probably we're going to have 15 artists in it. So that's not going to work. So the space that's going to be, so it may be a line. So we're experimenting with possible ways of situating it not on the wall, right, but in its own sort of meander through the space, But one of the things I've learnt about curating is that you end up with this...
Sorry.
It's all right. Happens to the best of us. I see bumped into somebody the other day who said, "Oh, you're the person who gave that lecture where your phone went off with a fault." I said, yeah. That's sort of changed it. So please do not worry about that. But it does involve adjusting yourself to what spaces you get given. I think this is a lovely space for it, because when there's nobody in here and you just come down and you just see this relationship between the objectness and the sequencing, and then I mean, you get the shadows, you get the sort of all sorts of effects that goes with it. There is a bit of a discussion about whether, if you had something like that running through, you would be distracted by the heads of the other people on the other side, and whether that will work. So it's a bit of a challenge, that
And
one.
will it be the large drawing? Will that be in a direct relationship with small drawings?
Yeah, what she usually likes, if it's possible, is in a sense to follow this round and then meet the macro, right? But within this space that wouldn't be possible. So in this case, you come in and do that. So it may be in Istanbul that there will be, the macro will be there, and then we'll run the thing. It's still up for debate, because we all have to kind of go and sit in the space and agonize. And I think for artists it must be agony, because you have an idea what will be perfect, and then people say, "We can't afford it, can't have that space. Oh, by the way, there's a whole chunk of the wall missing, or we're going to have to take, you will know that very well."
Yeah, no, it's just because of the beginning and the end, and one gets the sense, as you said, of walking around, and I wondered how you could install it in such a way that you would continue that.
Yeah, I think that's what she wants, to find some way to because of course it does involve your moving along the line with it, because she's sort of in training you. I mean, it's a good height for little people like me. I mean, Dutchmen would find it a difficult thing, given they're kind of like a foot taller than me, etc. But it's apparently it's the Metropolitan Museum of Art's, standards point in which you centre a hang. So it has some kind of history in it. But yeah, I think if one could do it in a wave form, which is obviously part of what this is, and then come back, it would be a very, very interesting spectatorial experience, wouldn't it? You'd really, the installation would itself be more physical. And the question would that become a kind of sculptural entity that would distract you from the ways in which you engage with drawing, if it was too much of an installation? I don't know what you think.
Yeah, we did think that the lighting with the boxes showing the shadows underneath as well would have distracted, but I think Christine actually liked that as well.
Mhm.
When she saw it, she said, "No, it really works well with the shadows."
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if there was something about Griselda, that height being based on the average height of a woman, that 60 inches, or a man, or is that just developed over years, and has it come from a male perspective or a female perspective?
As I say, my understanding is that it's a museological average. Obviously, because there'll be, little children and there'll be tall people, etc. But it says it where, this is, it is my eye line. So I don't know if since you're that much taller, what happens to you when you...
Yeah, well, it suits me perfectly, that's what I was thinking.
Okay,
But
suits you.
Is it sort of almost, I wonder if...
I don't. It's not like Chantal Ackerman setting up her camera, like at 5'1" height,
Right.
and seeing the world from there, having a low camera. This is a standard museum hang.
Also depends on, for example, these I want to get really up close.
Mhm.
So in a way, I'd say like averages are meaningless.
Yeah.
And also, I think the world should cater to little people.
Sorry?
The world should cater to little people.
Yeah, yeah.
The tall people can bend.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just with a filmmaker just recently who was smaller than me, and I thought this is an amazing experience to be taller than anybody apart from, not a child, but it was an interesting. One thing I didn't say, I just noticed in my notes, which is that this is the largest series that Christine's ever done, but she does work in series. And the first series is called Free Radicals, and then the other framework for her work, which is kind of conversation she had in a way, which was she went to a class reunion in the early, I think, 80s, and they were all asking, where's so-and-so, where's so-and-so, and one of them, who'd been the popular guy of the year, was killed in Vietnam. So she started a series, in memory of somebody who was killed in Vietnam. She's got 2 great series around Vietnam and called the Vietnam After Images. And then this led to another series which she did called, I have to write this one, which is There's No Such Thing as a Little Plutonium, which is a sort of interesting discussion in relation to the negotiations with Iraq, just a few, whatever they're called, what are the things that they're deciding they only can have a few. And then the other big series is called Some of the Pieces, PEACES, Are Missing, which is a whole huge series about another plane turning over, which are titled in the names of the word peace. I think this also brings back the kind of relationship to sort of history. I mean, I've introduced these in some sense in relation to a certain kind of cosmology or physics and the processes of, well, I could say, the world. I mean, it kind of puts it in relation to kind of Paul Klee and that notion of the self and the world on that kind of level. But there is underlying it also a very intense, as indeed there was with Hannah Wilkie and others, a sense of engagement with the urgencies of history, which these titles give them. So the next thing I need just is about, £200,000 or £300,000, please, to mount a retrospective of this whole body of work, which includes even a more recent series after this. But I wanted to bring that one up. Any other questions or?
I wanted to ask you about, we're here
Okay.
with a female artist, with a female gallerist and curator, and yourself as a woman, and you're talking about the Turkish Biennale being curated by a woman. I was wondering if you have perspective on that in terms of the achievements of feminism. Are we at sort of a good point now in feminist history?
There's an interesting question. Can I be a little bit picky? This is a bugbear of mine, which is, I think when the first outbreak of the new right to revolt was heralded in the 1960s and 70s, we called ourselves women because we used to be called girls. But I've noticed since in the last 10, 15 years, the notion of the female has come back. And it's an extraordinary political turn. So I'm glad you ended up saying I was a woman and Carolyn was a woman. I think we need to make a huge effort to think that through. So feminism doesn't get us to stop describing women as females. We haven't succeeded at all because we've just gone back into a biological term. So please don't take that, but please think about it because it has huge implications. How often? So when Mrs. Thatcher died and the television kept saying she's the first female prime minister, I kept shouting at the television, "Woman!" This is a very important, because that's the sociological, political category, femaleness and maleness, and it's an absolute trend, and it's an ideological, it's like the kind of the sea drawing back from the force of this politics around the sort of political collectivity, the subjectivity of women. So with that as a preliminary, we are absolutely nowhere near having the impact we should be having in terms of allowing us to imagine the world, particularly, let's say, in terms of art, that men and women make art side by side all the time, everywhere you look. And if you want to understand the history of the 20th century, the most remarkable feature of the beginning of modernism was men and women side by side, right? We could have exclusions before, we might have had ladies, art societies and, the Royal Academy, etc. But the history of modernity and modernism is that gender division breaks down. So people are, living together, they are working together, they are studying together. This is the sign of that it is modern. And when the history of that modern is written by those who actually were there, they saw Rodchenko, they saw Popova, right? And they were together, their drawing rooms were together, they were making work together. When Bar goes back to Russia, we get Rodchenko and we forget Popova. So there's something so extraordinary has happened to do with creating that notion, that void, that consistent building a history site where they're right there. I mean, all those women were probably still alive when I first started being an art historian, and there was not a book about a single one of them. Right? So within the 50s or 60s, so when they were my age, they had been disappeared. So if we manage to get the energy, to question that and make a project of just demanding the inclusive histories of the 20th century and of the present, it takes enormous amount of energy, and there is an impact in certain kinds of ways. But as far as my situation is concerned, when I leave the job that I'm in, the water will close over where I was. There's no notion that this is a subject you have to appoint somebody else into. There's going to be another generation. It will have been, and I don't think we should think in terms of achievement. I think you should understand what it takes for anybody to choose to dedicate themselves to this shifting of our understandings. Personally, it's a cost. I'm sure if Adriana was dedicating herself to certain people, she would have, thousands of pounds and things coming in. But if you to make the choice, you have to put in the work. Carolyn, I think, is a different figure in a way. I think she's sustained, she's done her apprenticeship and then she's done this, and she is demonstrating what inclusivity looks like, because it's also inclusive on all sorts of other levels, right? And then when people say, wow, this is so interesting, maybe then people begin to say, this is how it should be. Because we need all these different voices, from different parts of the world, and from different generations, and from different practices, if we're going to get hold of the world at all. So I think for me, my answer really is, it's not a matter of, has feminism succeeded? Feminism is part of a whole series of demands for an inclusivity and multiplicity and plurality to be presented to us, so that we all recognize ourselves in things like us and also things different from us. And then we would probably, to go back to where I started, not think in the terms of maleness and femaleness, right? But that there is an element of Americanness, there's an element of California education, there's an element of being over 70, there's an element of, having had 4 sons, that constitutes what it is that Christine Taylor Patton. But we had to fight for a while, just simply under this crudest of crude titles. Let's find out about women artists, because it was under that rubric, and that rubric alone, that the 20th century has committed this sort of cultural genocide, not a genocide, but a gynocide. And, it's as much as like the Entarter to Kunst. You say, here's all this work, we're just going to trash it, and that's what, in a sense, the 20th century did to women. So under that rubric, we have to say, wait a minute here, but at the same time, the complexity of what's on the walls is in the singularity of everything that composes this artist's, specific artistic project and sensibility and ethos and capacity. And if it's there, it just offers itself, and if it can be there in conversation with a group, I've mentioned that they are all women, but who therefore are significant because something needs to be explained. Why is that particular pressure to embody, to animate, to eroticize, to intellectualize, to spiritualize in some sense this abstraction? Why did it come from those women? What was the urgency? Then that becomes an interesting question. Not that they were all women, as if you know what that is, but why was that so urgent? Well, I have some explanations about what happens when you're not given access to your embodiment, that maybe that's an enormous pressure to do that. But at the same time, it will make us suddenly see that there isn't art by men, but their masculinities, their sexualities, their classes. We were talking about this with Linda Benglis. She comes from Louisiana, as does Rauschenberg. Go to Louisiana and you'll say, now I get a lot of this. I get the visual world she was growing up with, the Mardi Gras, the Cajun stuff, the mixture of French and Spanish, the fact that this is the place of jazz, and then this extraordinary landscape with these great oak trees with their long kind of, Spanish moss beards, I think, okay, I'm beginning to see this. Whereas, in a way, I also see, why I'm saying about New Mexico. Travel through that landscape and then think, what kind of, what's the world, in that. So I'm always for the more and more and more specific, but it includes gender and all sorts of other things that produce the place from which this is coming and which it offers to me in its uniqueness. Sorry, that was a very long answer. Virginia,
I'm interested to go to her subtext of the Biennale in Istanbul, A Theory of Thought Forms, which is linked to theosophy and Ledbetter's ideas. Is that, does she profess that? Does she talk about that? Is she bringing in the spiritual side of abstraction that surrounded all the male artists like Kandinsky and Malevich and Mondrian, who are all theosophists?
To be honest, I can't answer that yes or no formally, in the sense that I haven't had that kind of conversation with her. I think two things. One is that Carolyn is a profound Adornian, right? She comes out of a very, very strong philosophical tradition, which allows her to sense that there's always the other to whatever it is that you profess, that you always have to recognize the negativity, or both the negative and also the other to, etc. So I think she's interested in the fact that we have a story of the history of modern art that's been written. For instance, Alfred Barr was a very profound Protestant, right? And Protestant Christianity is not interested in a kind of symbolic or an imaginary in the same way as the Catholic Christianity is in a particular kind of way. And, it has a particular kind of redemptive projection. Whereas when we look at the history of the 20th century art, people are crazily mixing with all sorts of things. One of the big repressions is the relationship to the occult and to the spiritual. So again, there was you go back to listening to reading Clay and all the others, and they are talking about the cosmos, and that's the stuff that we know. The sort of formalist account kind of puts away because they don't know how to accommodate it to the particular, kind of cleaned up, Protestant rationalist model that we've been given. And I'm not buying into it because, you know, I'm not going to be sensitive to it, but at the same time, it's come back to us from when you read the contemporary physics, right? And when you start going into these conversations that are coming from a different sorts of ways, they're not talking about on that kind of level of spiritual, but they clearly are. You know, what I was saying about mathematics, there's clearly this sense that there's something else. And I think Carolyn's orientation is much more towards the notion of allowing ourselves to to challenge the anthropocentrism of the rationalist Western model and accept that we are dependent on and coexist with both what one could call the kind of cosmic forces of what the physicists are demonstrating to us, but also what the biologists are demonstrating to us, and even what the kind of really crazy feminist historians of science, whether think of Donna Haraway or Karen Barad, are trying to say to us about actually how do these little thingies that we're made up of actually operate, that they're not rational and, serial and, rigid. We're all various kinds of hybrid. They're extremely queer, basically. They just are doing all sorts of mixings and couplings and all the rest of it, etc. So there's a kind of way that this language of the philosophy of science and of contemporary science is pushing us to what it seems at the beginning of the 20th century they only had this slightly theosophist or occultist or spiritualist way of talking. But now I think we can do it without imagining there's some kind of other world, because this is just very other. When you're reading, Hawkins on time and black holes and stuff, you have to be I think you can't be an empiricist, you have to be a post-structuralist, because, these things can be. So I think that she's not fixing back to that, but borrowing something which challenges certain kinds of aspects of Western rationality and the sort of unchallenged reason in favour of these different kinds of unreason that are being revealed to us, including, that's why, the whole area of neuroscience isn't something she's interested in because she's going down the road which is, if only we could work out how the brain is, we'd know how we are. But actually we have to have that relationship to the otherness, not just the psychoanalytical otherness of the unconscious, but the otherness of our, particle and molecular and the processes. And it's, if you think that the dominant discourse now is of the infinite plasticity of the brain, whereas I bet you 10, 15 years ago, before the genome things, okay, that was it, you were born with this is how your brain, brain got damaged, that was it. Whereas now, they're worrying, of course, that our brains are so plastic that, we can, I'm not the same, well, I'm certainly not the same person, but the interface with technology is already altering the very forms of human beings. So I think this is a really interesting debate, but very tricky one. But I don't think it's not a kind of recuperation, but it is a recognition that we can allow ourselves to open that debate, that conversation, as the underside of the 20th century that shouldn't just be the alternative to rationality. It plays with it.
So, sorry, just to follow it up, do you think that is there a tendency for abstraction overall? Will there be other artists working in an abstract way, or is she?
I don't think. No, I think the sites of this sort of. I unexpectedly find myself curating or contributing two elements of abstraction to it. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't think. So no, I think there will be all sorts of things made with matter, and I think there will be organic things doing things, and I think there will be word things and So I don't know the other 48 artists. Well, I know about 5 of them who are the ones who are in every Christophe Bakagiev show. There's the team, there's Lawrence Weiner, Pierre Hugues, William Kentridge, I don't know, a couple of others, they are the companions with which she has thought for many years. And I quite like that idea of people, having that. Ben, you had a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask about the choice of we've touched upon the shadows a bit already, but it seems to me that you have this very disciplined, controlled mark on each paper, and then the choice to have the box around it is making a new, really strong mark on some of them from the outside. So it's like she's controlled it to what she's done, but then this allowance of some of them are completely changed by a shadow that's as strong as the drawing itself. And I was thinking if that had a relationship to the time thing, because if this was in the day, it would, with sunlight and you had a time-lapse camera, you'd be watching that the real time of a day crossing the picture. Is that something that she was deliberately doing? Because it's quite a dramatic frame, isn't it?
I mean, there is a contingency in any installation for an artist between, obviously, the tryout in your own studio and the track where you can control the lighting and things like this. So, I mean, ideally, I think we might, it's other artists that I worked with, where you really would spend a lot of time absolutely getting the lighting to the point at which the contingency of what the lighting is in this room would be then controlled as a supplementary event that the artist would have to deal with here, right? I mean, it has this very strong effect, you're right, because of the angle of the lighting.
But she must have, because it'd be impossible for it not, with that choice of a box around it, it'd be impossible for them not to have a shadow. It must be a choice.
I mean, it's interesting because the other artists, obviously, that I work with quite a lot, Brahe Ettinger, where the precise sense that there is a shadow image when it's exhibited is part and parcel of this idea that it's a sort of a haunted image in a way. I don't recall when I originally showed these in a few years ago, I don't recall this being quite so marked, because I think if the ceiling is higher and the light is more centralized, you would not quite have the same reflections. But it is interesting because it, inserts as it goes along, and this gets more distorted and then gets doubled. So I think but that's part and parcel of what happens that you can go with. I don't think it's disturbing it.
No, I thought it was a deliberate dynamic thing.
Yeah.
But
I will ask her.
The artist did not install this shadow, did she?
No.
So who knows?
We will ask her.
But the artist chose to have the acrylic boxes on each piece of work.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as I can see it, that is the work. That's what the work is. And but it's kind of out of sync with some of the descriptions that you read out that she had actually written, which was all about the crow quill
Yeah.
and the tiny bit of ink and the piece of very specific paper, which I don't know what that is. And so I haven't got a problem with using the square form or the plastic as well as paper, plastic that's not sort of natural substance in love. That's not a problem, but it mismatches with that description.
Well, it's possibly. I think when you come up close, obviously, when all the lights are on and it's not quite a sort of nuts. You do get through to that the central materiality of the action at the beginning. When she had a show of a different part of this sequence at the Drawing Centre in New York, they were not framed, and they were they were mounted on a kind of concertina of paper, standing on a shelf with a single Perspex, box that covered, one, let's say, run of 25 or 30. So there are different ways, and they won't be box framed in Istanbul. This is just one sequencing of it. So I think then they will be, and the 24-foot drawing isn't going to be framed. It's just going to be, the wall is going to be indented, so that it's not directly on the wall, but it's held, it's just pinned up, and so you will then get the feeling of the edges of the paper. But we've framed that one upstairs to match this, to give it a certain
Because
consistency
I
of
thought
look.
that because you were talking about the Western American landscape,
Mm-hmm.
I sort of thought maybe she was having a bit of an argument with minimalist work, like a Judd, which would be so absolutely, utterly perfect, the material, the way the material gets put together is so exact. I thought perhaps she was commenting on that.
Mm.
But if those drawings are exhibited in a different way, then that would be a case to me.
Yeah, I don't think it's in her nature to in a sense, have that kind of argument. I don't think there's a kind of sense of what I'm not doing. There's much more the sense of what would happen if I do this. I don't know those who know her as well.
It seems to me that the process is so important in her work, and that overrides a lot of other things. I mean, sometimes artists can't be in control of everything they're doing,
Mm-hmm.
As sad as that might be, but the process is foremost, I think, with her, and it's some kind of a connection with her unconscious mind,
Mm-hmm.
and these things come out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very precise in the way she does them, but now they're in another place, and maybe this is, it'll be interesting to see how they look presented in another way.
Mm-hmm.
So often an artist can't see all of their works together, because their studio, can't accommodate that.
Yeah, and when people buy works, they frame them in different sorts of ways. So there's always a kind of potential for them to do. But I think this it's a very interesting to hear you talk about this because obviously this adds this is this question of adding a certain objectness to each drawing, and then objectness to this, and then that is going to invite environmental effects like lighting and shadow to add a layer to it, and to see them without this quality. I don't know. I think it gives them a presence, the being framed, in relation to this idea that you're just invited. In one sense, your classic notion of what an exhibition is these pictures hanging in a line, the notion of on the line. And she's taken the line that she's working with as a drawing, and the line then that it actually marks into the space. So those are things that are kind of correlated, because this question is of the line. There's one story I didn't mention which I love, which is about when she was in her drawing classes and they had to bring something that would make a line to class, and she talks about how somebody brought this great sort of machine that he'd built, some kind of piggly machine, which then sort of walked across the room in a kind of mechanical way and left things. And what Christine brought was a worm in some sand, which endlessly then sort of moved. So that it sort of perplexes me, because on one hand that feels so on the side of the organic and the kind of viscous and the lively and the, on the one hand, icky, but also that it's drawing. And then this jewel-like effect that comes from the kind of opacity of the perspex as it forms the box shape.
I was thinking without perspex, quite vulnerable, and that ties in with what you were saying about the wriggling worms.
Mhm.
It's interesting
Yeah, they do become very much more because you kind of pay more attention to the torn paper. You know, it's not cut paper; it's torn paper, and obviously all of those things are the ones that are considered.
I like it because it's that thing of just allowing what would come of it. You know, it's what was saying about what was the word? That not to be so precious, that it is part of the elements. You know, once it's up, I mean, to me, it's beautiful because of it being that it wasn't calculated. You know, there is this thing of what is within the drawings, and then within this sort of, you see the opacity of the framing that then sort of leaks out and into. So it just extends on her work, really.
Has she said anything about the difference in working on these very different scales? Because these are 1 inch, and the other piece that she's working on is it going to be 7 meters by
2.3, so it's yeah.
It's quite a different scale to work on, and you know that means the marks are quite different.
The marks aren't that much different. So this,
they're
I mean,
much in scale. They're much larger. It means.
No, I mean because I mean these, I mean these will be made on a gesture that's of that kind of order. The other, even when you look at the upstairs, the biggest mark is the arc of the hand moving. I mean it is absolutely handmade in that sense. So when she makes the 24-foot drawing, it's you know, it starts on a big roll and is a bit, you know, taken out. And I mean I've seen it sort of, it's a double, obviously a double height, so she's got to have a moving thing to go up and down to kind of get it. But when she's actually at the surface, she's in the same relationship, not quite the same relationship as this one.
I did get a peek at this thing.
Yeah.
And it is very large, and it did seem to me, you know, quite ambitious. I mean, I was very impressed that she was making this thing so large, because it's very different. To me, it seemed totally different from working on a scale like this, because I mean, it's very big.
Yeah, but
it's very impressive to see.
I mean, it is very big, but the thing is that what you're saying about kind of, you know, what happens in the drawing, which is you scratch, you know, your the mark she's making is as I was saying, is producing light or blocking out light. And so when she's actually on the structure working at it, I mean, you know, you're working at that distance, you know, doing it. It's not that she's going to make gestures like that.
No, I think that's
you know, and that's the thing. So the capacity, which is partly why it can actually happen, is because it's what in, you know, once you set the plane, which is ultimately going to turn, it's going to actually, it's going to happen, I'm not going to say it's going to happen organically, but it's produced little tiny section by little tiny section, which has the same effect of what happens here to get to here to get to here is still also the same logic that's happening on that big drawing as she moves from little bit to little bit. And I mean, the big drawing it's taken 12 years to make it.
And it looks to me like a very organic piece of work. You know, I know it's many things, but she's not, I mean, sure, she's somewhere, she's thinking about what she's doing, but also it is doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is doing her.
Yeah. But I think that's what she describes about, you know, this endless discovery. What is it that I'm going to discover that's going to be revealed by this relationship between a certain protocol, the hand gesture, the pen, the ink, the amount of ink that she's puts on each dip. You know, there's all those sorts of wonderfully sort of modernist elements that you get taught in the studios about, you know, think through every single material element, you know, because that's where it's actually going to happen. And then the process, the time, you know, which is why I call it, you know, drawing time and the time of drawing, because, you know, it is encoding real time to be made. It is encoding the time of its own making. It is encoding the time that the body has absorbed and lives and is the depository of, as a person at the time, but also then the time it will take you to actually even encompass a drawing of that size and to see it both macro and closely. And what it itself is about is, on that kind of Hawkins type level, about the question of what do we understand time to be. Time is this process of becoming that has these little elements to it. So you're right, the organicness of the tension between the sort of what might be a certain, not geometry, but this thing about the turning of a plane or the wave form. These are the two core elements of the big drawings, etc. But they do give this physicality, this relation to the body, and I mean some of the early works are, which are illustrated in the sort of, in my book, are just extraordinarily physical in ways that are associated with the fullness of bodies, the interiors of bodies, the bulginess of bodies, the movement of bodies, so that they are, without being in any way descriptive, they become kind of erotic in a kind of non-genital but very kind of way, which is infinitely more extraordinary and fascinating, I have to say, than certain artists of that generation who took the erotic body at a literal level of organs. So there is that tension, but you're going to see it here. Some of these get quite kind of, but it's just, what's the implication of a sphere as opposed to, a plane? So it's going back to this question of, like mathematics, there's a sort of a language which describes processes that we suddenly see and that get associated. Anyway, I'm babbling now. So maybe we should release you from this. Thank you so much for your questions.